Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to the continuing story of Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. And in these episodes, we've been talking about the evolution of our wonderful waterfront here, how it was first discovered, if you will, by Spanish explorers, how it was used to advantage by colonists of the Spanish, French, and British, how we became a part of commerce in the lumbering era, how the bay itself just literally was transformed as the railroads arrived, as lumbering interests put piers out into the waterfront. All of this changed the entire look, so that by the time we came to the year 1900, one might easily say that most, not all, but most of the economy of this area was centered on Pensacola's waterfront. By that time, the George Washington Wright Mill was here, the Ricks Robinson Mill was here, the Navy, of course, continued to operate the Navy Yard. All of these things were working well, and of course, we had three separate fishing fleets here servicing that industry. Into the beginning of the 20th century, some other things begin to evolve. About this time, and this of course goes back for just a few years, we had the arrival here of two very far-sighted men interested in railroading. The names were Roy McGargle and Henry McLaughlin. And McLaughlin and McGargle, first of all, built a line across southern Alabama, intending to build it all the way to New Orleans originally. It went about 30 miles in there. This was the Pensacola, Mobile, and New Orleans. They built a dock along the waterfront here in Pensacola, so we had now still another railroad dock here. About the same time, the Pensacola Streetcar Company, the transit company, decided the time was right for them to build a line which would service the Navy Yard. And so beginning in 1892 and then somewhat beyond that, they built their line from the terminus at Main Street and Jefferson across the Bayou Chico, along the waterfront, all the way out to the Navy Yard. Originally, this utilized little steam engines called dummy engines, so this became known as the dummy line. Ultimately, it was electrified. So as we move into the 20th century, here we have this line moving out there carrying several trains a day, which would haul both passengers and freight to the Navy Yard. In 1903, by 1903, our naval stores business was growing very rapidly, and the two large companies locally, the R.J. Saunders Company, actually there were three companies, Saunders Company, A.M. Moses, and the Boyer Company, all needed to have a way to bring the collected pine gum that was being collected in settlements along the Gulf. They needed to bring it into Pensacola where it could be refined and then sent to factories and customers up north. So they purchased and put in place a new steamship line. This became known as the Gulf and St. Andrews Steamship Company. It had one ship, and that ship began operating here in August of 1903, and it would continue for 34 years as basically the only way you could regularly depend on transit for yourself as a passenger or for some port of commerce back and forth from the little ports all the way from Mobile all the way to Carabel. So the tarpon was what it was called, of course, and this was a real part of allure along the Gulf. Its home base here was the Comandancia Street Fort. Oh, we move into the early part of the 19 teens. At this point in time, still another element arrives. In 1911, the Navy Yard had closed, but 3 years later, the United States Navy elected to begin naval aviation training here. So beginning in January of 1914, a portion of the waterfront along what we today call the Navy area was transformed into a naval training center. And of course, we all know the story of that it has continued very successfully. They don't fly seaplanes taking off in the bay anymore, but nonetheless, that's the way it began, but nonetheless, this has become a very major part of the economy of this entire region. By the time we get into the middle of the 1920s, the waterfront begins to change because slowly but surely, the lumbering era is coming to an end, mainly because they had cut down most of the trees and there had been virtually no efforts made at reforestation. The railroads continue to expand, and we have one other addition that we want to talk about particularly, originally. This was again the product of the work of McLaughlin and McGargle. These two men had a dream. They wanted to create a railroad here that first of all would move out of Pensacola, move north as far as Memphis, then connect to north to St. Louis, then perhaps project over into the southwest, into the Texas, New Mexico, Arizona area. But their real dream was to make that road effective all the way to the northwest to the states of Washington and Oregon. These men began. Their first railroad was called the Pensacola, Alabama, and Tennessee, and it inched its way forward. I won't go into the details of how they proceeded, except to say that they did build a railroad dock, a warehouse and dock on the west side of the bay, just about 3 blocks west of the Palafox Street Wharf. And as that was proceeding, of course, that railroad was sold, changed hands several times. Ultimately, it became the Frisco Railroad in 1926, and that railroad, of course, further expanded the docks and warehouses just about at the foot of where Spring Street is today. In that same period, beginning about 1910, 11, 12, Pensacola has a whole new element arriving in its economy. Of course, that is the automobile and the engine-driven truck. And of course, to supply this, not only do we have to have dealers that would supply the sales and maintenance of the vehicles, but then you had to have a way to make them run. And so beginning about 1911-12, we begin to see the arrival here of companies that will import motor fuel, gasoline, and the like. And these became known. These were the Chevron Company, and a little bit later than that, the Pure Oil Company, which was, of course, run by the Sherrill family. All of these companies arrived, put together little warehouses and docks right along the waterfront on the west side of town. So we have still another element that goes into the evolution of the waterfront there. These docks would continue in operation for a great many years. Well, we move to the latter part of the 1920s. And by this time, you could begin to see the great traffic and trade in lumber beginning to trail off. The city of Pensacola was very concerned about. The Chamber of Commerce was the junior chamber. They held they conducted the first of many very in-depth surveys that have been made of our area to say, what shall we do next? We've got to change. Well, I wish I could tell you that the results of the survey brought about some immediate positive changes. That did not happen. But by the time we get to 1928, just a year or so after that, the Frisco had completed its trackage, so that it was finally reaching not all, but most of the dream that McGargle and McLaughlin had. We had this wonderful dock on the west side. We continued to have the L&N facilities on the east side. Things are going along reasonably well, and then came the Great Depression. Well, the Depression hit the waterfront just as it hit everything. It affected fishing. It affected railroading. It affected the latter stages of the lumbering era, so that by the time we reached the end of the 1930s, people are saying, well, what is going to happen to Pensacola? Our waterfront, which has been our lifeline for years, is gradually running downhill. But then came World War II. Now, our waterfront area here did not see a lot of commerce coming forth out of the south or other areas, bringing products for the war effort. That really didn't happen much. But in beginning in 1941-42, as commerce was being put together to send supplies to the Allies, and particularly to Great Britain, we began to put together convoys. And a great number of the convoys, which would go around the Keys in Florida and on their way to Britain, and then later to France, would pass through Pensacola. And there are some wonderful photographs that we still have here that shows a lot of these ships in the bay waiting to come into convoy state to be escorted by naval warships on their way east across the Atlantic. Now, in 1943, still another step was taken. By now, a number of our business people here were saying, look, the railroads have lost interest in Pensacola. They see their future in their operations to the west. They're not maintaining the docks. They're not building new facilities. Some of them have kind of rotted away. And so at the request of, beginning with a man by the name of Calvin Todd, a team was put together, approached first the city and then the state legislature, asking to create a Pensacola Port Authority, a group of people who would be solely interested locally here in the management and operation of the the docks on a more aggressive way. And the legislature approved in 1943, and for the next 14 years the Port Authority existed, but they didn't own anything along the waterfront. They had no influence there at all. They did acquire a cotton compress north of the city, which gave them a small source of income, but nothing much happened until we get to the year 1957. And in 1957, the railroads finally reached a point where they said, well, you're right, we're no longer interested. And in May and then in June, first the L&N and then the Frisco literally gave their docks and warehouses on the waterfront to the Pensacola Port Authority. And as that happened, of course, this authority was made up of 12 men, all of whom had interests on the waterfront. They wanted to see the port succeed. They were in all sorts of different businesses, and almost at once you could see a change take place. These men quickly brought in the importing of foreign automobiles. They developed a huge trade with various sources in Cuba. They began to import a great deal of mahogany lumber. Things were just booming. For example, they produced a magazine that looked just like this. This magazine was first published in May of 1957 and would be continued to be published by the port for the next 35 years. This was a magazine that told the story of the port and promoted its use all over the country. Well, the Port Authority was successful. By the end of 1958, after about a year and a half, they were going, well, we would say great guns. And then tragedy struck. In November of 1958, fire of undetermined origin swept across the Commandancy and Barrack Street docks and literally burned them to the waterline. It was a terrible, devastating blow, but the Port Authority never hesitated. They quickly moved to put in temporary facilities, and then they moved into an alliance with the city to get the city's backing for bonding power so that they could borrow money and rebuild. And this is what they did. And basically, reconstruction began there late in 1960. The first stage of the new port was completed by the month of February in 1963. And things again began to pick up. Money was being earned. The port was doing well. We move forward to 1966, and then tragedy struck for a second time, because again, a fire of undetermined origin swept across the Frisco docks, and it literally burned the whole business right to the waterline. Now we have to add here one little story that is important to understand Pensacola's future from that point forward. The L&N gave their materials, their docks, their warehouses to the Port Authority with no strings attached. The Frisco had a caveat. And it was this: if at some time the Frisco dock and Upland Trade Center there were not used for port purposes, then the Frisco had the right to reclaim that property and take it back. Well, the fire of 1966 was devastating. But by this time, of course, the Port Authority was expending all of its efforts, all of the money it could raise, to build on the east side of the city, the new port. By the time we get to 1967-68, the port is still doing well. And at this point, its bank account is growing. And at that point in time, and this is a story that some folks don't like to hear, but it's basically it's true. By that time, that money was there, the cash flow was good, and we had a new city manager at that time who saw all of this and reasoned to himself, aha, why can't the city just take that over? It has the right to do so. Take it over, put all that money in the general fund, and we'll run the port ourselves. And so in 1969, they did indeed take over the running of the port and abolished the Pensacola Port Authority. About the same time, 3 years had passed now since the fire, and the Frisco Railroad looked around and said, well, Pensacola and the Port Authority no longer exists. Nobody is taking action. That property is not being used for port purposes, for commerce. So we're taking that property back. And they did. And so beginning in early 1970, the Frisco began to try and market the use of that property for commercial purposes to benefit their own railroad, because they still had their freight line on the side. They did not succeed. But then a few years later, they said, well, we'll turn this over to real estate developers. Maybe they can do better. And so they put the property there in the hands of what became known as the Trillium Company, a large land development company on the West Coast. And that's where things stood as we moved into the 1980s.